Hello and welcome to the Political Pulse, a podcast where we dive in depth into various global issues and various power dynamics. I'm your host Xavier, and today we'll invite Dr. Hale to the podcast. Dr. Hale has contributed knowledge there of global political science. Today we will talk about the plethora of concerns that come with the various power scenes that we see in the world today, which is unforeseen and unprecedented. Today we get the chance to discuss America, its power dynamic, and its challenge with China for global hegemony. So Dr. Hale, is there a potential for us to see a change from America being a global hegemony to a bipolar or multipolar system?
I would argue that we're already in a situation where there's this fracturing of American hegemony that's been taking place. I think ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. So I think there's this possibility. I think we're living through it now. Especially so after 91, the Cold War is over. America kind of sees itself as the hegemon, the key power. It's in a very powerful position to enact whatever kind of change it wants to on a global stage. This comes with all the kind of backlash around that. While it's expanding its power, and it is definitely expanding its power through international institutions, and it's mopping up the rest of those other nation states into organizations like NATO, and it's driving a key role in the World Trade Organization, this is creating a lot of opposition on the world stage. And you see this especially after September 11, where there's this knee-jerk response to this brand of a kind of American adventurism. America thinks, in its hubris, you could argue, that it could invade Afghanistan and invade Iraq and replace the governments with democratic ones, maybe make some money off oil in the process, and it will be spreading freedom. And I think the Iraq War really showed the limitations of American hegemony, because to be hegemonic, you have to have the power to lead and the power to coerce. And even when America enters the war in Afghanistan, it can only get a few nation states to follow it, its closest Western partners. It can't actually get the UN to agree to do this. So you can see that hegemony is already declining before it even gets to Afghanistan. So when it steps into that vacuum in Afghanistan and it starts fighting this really brutal 20-year affair that it ultimately loses, which is very reminiscent in some ways of Vietnam, you really do think the American hegemony here, its ability to coerce and be able to convince people to join it on future adventures in the Middle East, that has been fundamentally undermined. And I think, especially, you've probably read about Mir Sharma's take on the NATO situation and the invasion of Ukraine. And yeah, I think to some extent, Russia's response is about countering American growing influence in the region. So I think when you become a hegemon, you instantly create this competitive cycle for other groups to try and push you out of that key position. And in this case, I think America has increasingly fallen out of favor with a lot of especially non-Western states.
Yeah, it's interesting seeing all of America's various international adventures with its enforcement of its security. So on a slightly related note to America's domestic situation, where we see this sort of change in America's dynamic within, do you think that America's domestic affairs under this new administration is restricting its international power?
Under the Biden administration or under
Yes.
Trump administration?
With specific focus on the Biden administration.
Okay, so I will just say a little bit about Trump just so I can contrast the two. I think Trump made quite a few mistakes in office, especially relating to Russia, to China, and to Saudi Arabia, which really undermined the prestige, the legitimacy of the US as a global hegemon, the kind of values and aspirations it shares, and the focus on putting America first. I mean, if you want to be a hegemon, you have to convince people that you want to lead them in a direction that's going to benefit them. If you're just convincing them that you're going to put America first, well, you're not going to have a lot of success getting a lot of people to follow you. So coming to like this current administration and how that's kind of impacted their international power, these domestic affairs, I think post-Trump, the environment in the US has been so polarized, so sharp edged between the two major parties, that it definitely restricts its international power. Because when people look at the US as a aspirational democracy during the 1990s, everyone, especially in former Soviet states, was looking at the US as a kind of model to emulate. It's hard to find many states today that would want to look at the US and say, hey, I want that system. Because the domestic politics in the US seems so partisan and kind of, just really plagued by things like government shutdowns, where the system just frequently kind of shuts itself down. And we're definitely going to see that in the next couple of years because the Republicans have the House. I don't know how many other countries want that. So it really undermines their soft power, their ability to convince people like this is the way, this is the American way of life is great. A lot less people think that now. Hard power, domestic politics is never really going to be able to affect that in America just because it spends such a huge percentage of its GDP on military force. Its domestic politics isn't really going to affect its hard power to a significant extent, other than its ability to kind of raise guerrillas and raise liberation fronts in other countries. But soft power, definitely. Domestic politics plays a big role in your soft power if you're the global hegemon. And in this case, I think the decline of America's ability to build consensus, to build common ground in their own politics, has made it look increasingly dysfunctional to the rest of the world.
Now, with this dysfunction, obviously, we've got this sort of crippling of the American dream, as many could say, of all of these people in Europe, seeing that the American dream isn't the once very favoured thing they saw at the end of World War II, the liberation of places like France and Germany, which sort of saw this America which promoted this freedom. So is there any way America can implement any new ways to protect its global power?
I think America is always in the process of protecting its global power in one way or another. As much as it might be talking about the concepts of freedom and liberty, it's a very American conception of those ideas that it wants to defend. I mean, France had its own revolution. It's had its own freedom for a very long time. I mean, Britain's had its own freedoms and liberties before America had those freedoms and liberties. And it opened those liberties to more people before America did as well. So, yeah, I think it's always trying to protect its global power. When we think about soft power, definitely it's trying to project its values on the world constantly. That is the reason that Hollywood is so subsidized by the Californian government, is because they see a real value in promoting American values. And American interest groups also do the same thing for the same reasons. They want to promote what the American dream is, what the American idea of capitalism is. Because once they start accepting that there's other views around this, it's going to fundamentally undermine their ability to convince people that this is the only way to become more successful as a nation is to emulate America, is to have low taxes, is to do the kind of policies that Americans benefit from as a nation. Other countries doing because they can get cheap goods from them and they can do all this other stuff. So you can't convince people to act in your interest anymore. You're going to find it's very hard to project that global power outwards. When we're thinking of other ways that they can be using power in this regard, they're definitely trying to protect it through hard power as well. And I think you've definitely covered the South China Sea in global politics.
Yes.
Yeah. They're constantly touring American aircraft carriers, American ships through the South China Sea to kind of demonstrate their commitment to Taiwan. So there is a sharp edge to American power, and they're more than happy to show that off where they think they can use it to limit the policy options of other countries like China, and limit the policy options of countries like Russia, and limit the policy options of countries in the Middle East that they think might be potentially hostile to them, like Iran. So where they get the opportunity to showcase some military power through cooperative drills with Israel, which they did recently, was the biggest military drill in history between the two countries. That's definitely aimed at Iran and aimed at the Middle Eastern countries to show, hey, we're still the biggest game in town. Don't you get any ideas about trying to get your own forms of democracy and your own forms of freedom accepted on the international stage. This is the form of freedom and liberty that's accepted, and we reinforce it with tanks and missiles.
Yeah. Now, to its growth with global power, we can see that America's always been chasing this dream as a global hegemon. Whether it still is successful or in the future it will be more successful, it's been the security glue of NATO. It's had a strong presence in Europe. It's stopped all of these European states, which a lot of political philosophers such as John Miyashima has argued is just not even European states anymore. It's just this one big NATO conglomerate which is just supplied by America. Now, does America have any boundaries regarding its growth with global power?
So like ways in which its ability to exert that power is somewhat, limited, or it cannot redirect them in the ways that it wants. I think China has produced real boundaries to what America can do in terms of its ability to influence, especially through soft power, and its ability to convince people that it can be in their self-interest. I think if you look at Africa, for example, Africa went through a really tough period because it took all these loans out from the from the World Bank during the 1960s, and then in the 1970s, American fiscal policy absolutely just destroyed them because they massively increased interest rates and they shift away from the gold standard. And so those African countries had to take out IMF loans, which caused them to open up, and it actually made Africa one of the poorest regions in the world. It was actually on really good growth terms before that event. So from an African perspective, a lot of people, and I know it's a big continent, it's full of 50 nations, but many African nations do feel as though the US only helps them with strings attached when it's in their interest. Whereas China is happy to step in, offer them interest-free loans, no conditions, no strings attached. Or maybe this one string, don't recognize Taiwan, and maybe you have to use Chinese laborers, but hey, if you want free roads, you want free stadiums, you want free infrastructure, China's more than happy to step in and provide the means with which for you to get that. So there's big limitations here on America's ability to project power into the developing world, especially in, I think, post-colonial societies, and especially in post-colonial societies that have had bad experiences with America in the past, because they just simply cannot win over the populace they could in other countries. Because I think earlier you were talking about the Marshall Plan after World War II, and you were saying, hey, look, this really recruited Europeans into the American way of life. They said, yeah, this is great, free money from America, we value the same things. Like, America really wooed the European continent. They didn't do that with some parts of the world like Africa and large parts of Asia. And as a result, those parts of the world have never really benefited in the same way. And so some of the key issues we're facing this century, like climate change, require all the world to come together to solve that issue. But you can see why China might be able to say with the developing world, hey, we've experienced colonialism. We are also going through the Industrial Revolution that you guys had, that we actually, you profited hugely off us during that revolution. So why should we be the ones now to pay the burden of climate change? That should be you. You should be suffering now, not us. And so China is able to win over a lot of the developing world in places like the UN. And so that severely curtails the US's ability to win hearts and minds, but also to pass resolutions through the General Assembly of the UN.
Yeah. Now, moving forward into the future of the globe, seeing what will happen, is America likely to implement any new liberal type policies, which are sort of main free liberal policies of governments such as like democracies, always friendly to other democracies? Is there any chance for America to implement more liberal policies in the future?
Okay, so do you mean, are they going to be pursuing like liberal domestic policies, or are they going to be pursuing like a liberal foreign policy?
Liberal foreign policies.
Okay, so I mean, those two are tied in. Will they be promoting the same liberal things they've always wanted to promote? Like, will they be promoting open markets? For sure. America benefits hugely from open markets because it's never really had to fully open its own market. So you benefit quite well, and you can still protect your core industries. Will it still be pushing some of the things it's always been pushing? I don't know. I think its domestic policy affects his foreign policy a lot. And when you've now made abortions very difficult to access, and there's a case in the US Supreme Court now that looks to be set, and I can't confirm whether it will or won't because we don't know yet, but it looks to be overturning black economic empowerment in the US. And there's another case that might also make it possible for people to refuse to provide services to people who are homosexual on the basis of their own religion. Given the Supreme Court's recent rulings, we can surmise that these cases are likely to be very controversial, and they could definitely further undermine America's prestige. And if this is their domestic policy, it is incredibly hard for other states to stomach resolutions backed by the UN, which are saying, hey, you're violating human rights because you've denied women the rights to abortions. Well, I'm sorry, but you can't get them in America, home of the free and the brave. How can you possibly expect to get them in another country around the world? Force that when we have our own social values. So I think my response to your question is it going to take a liberal approach? Probably in its economic policies, I would say yes, depending on the economic circumstances to follow. But in its cultural policies, I think we're going to see a lot more reservations from America regarding the kind of socially liberal policies that it has seemed to embrace over the last century.
Thank you. Now I get the chance to switch over to my co-host, Nikki.
With the questions I have here today, they're mainly about like China and America's political relationship, and with China and America being political rivals, and the global political climate intensifying at a rapid rate with unprecedented consequences. Being two great powers, it's hard to predict what might occur between the two countries with extremely powerful nations. So, Dr. Hale, what is China's history with regards to surveillance via balloons?
Oh, via balloons. Very specific.
Yeah, that's a recent case that's been going on with China, yeah.
Okay. Well, apparently China's been sending out balloons for a little while. They sent 3 during the Trump administration.
Yeah.
But over relatively unpopulated areas. So these were kind of testing grounds to see what they can get away with in terms of undermining US sovereignty. The latest one, I mean, it's unclear based on the chatter whether this was on purpose or an accident or deliberately calculated, because it comes right before Biden's delivering a State of the Union address, which is very important. And this balloon incident deliberately blows that out of the water. Yeah. So it very much undermines Biden going into his second half of his first term. So it could be deliberate policy by the Chinese. It could be to embarrass America, to make them look weak on the world stage.
Yeah.
Given how, relatively primitive we've been led to believe the actual technology on the balloon is, it doesn't seem to have compromised US national security to a high level. It seems they knew that, so they let it fly for longer. But it's another attempt by China to kind of assert, hey, you're going to send, in my mind, I can't confirm or deny, but if China's saying, if you're going to send fighter jets over the South China Sea and do military drills with South Korea, well, we might just go ahead and send the occasional surveillance balloon over on our end, just to let you know that you're not the only game in town.
And do you think China was successful in doing that?
I think very much they have put Joe Biden in a very awkward situation.
Yeah.
And Joe Biden's a much bigger threat than Trump was as president to China, in my mind, at least. So is it trying to undermine Biden for a potential return for a Republican president that they'll be more easily able to woo? Very much this might have been effective for them. But at the same time, the Chinese government's response was kind of a fumbling mess of them coming in a bit late and saying, oh, yeah, they issued a formal apology, which they don't usually do after these things. So was it actually just an accident as well? Were they actually meant to be spying on another nation, or did they mean to put in a depopulated zone that flew elsewhere? It's really unclear. So was it a success? Time will tell.
I'm sure it will. Is there any likeliness that this will intensify aggression between America and China?
Look, I doubt this one event will intensify a lot. Biden during his State of the Union address, clearly very hostile to China. China during his when he was discussing at the party congress, clearly very hostile to the US in language. In practice, neither of them can afford at the moment a return to a trade war or an actual war. So I don't think this one event is really going to result in a huge amount of implications for either country.
What valid reasons does China have to threaten America's security in this way?
Well, if I was China, I'd be arguing that the US has been threatening Chinese security for a long time with long-range missiles, places like Taiwan and Japan, with military drills in the South China Sea, a territory it claims it owns. It's sovereign Chinese territory, according to China. So from a Chinese perspective, this is just like almost a nothing blip for them. This isn't even a retaliation. This is just a very low-level attempt to humiliate America at worst, which could have been a lot worse from the Chinese perspective. So from their end, this was minor interruption to US politics.
And how will China's violation of American airspace sovereignty influence the global community as a whole?
I'm not sure it's going to have a huge amount of implications here. It's clear that China can fly balloons wherever it wants to fly balloons. It's got satellites in orbit as well. So, and the US has its own satellites in orbit for spying. So the major powers have been spying on themselves, on each other for a very long time.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's going to be huge implications here in terms of actual change in policy from either major nation. You just might see the US and its allies pursue a more consistent and more closely tied together security arrangement.
Yeah. All right, well, those are all the questions that we had today. Thank you, Dr. Hale, for joining us on the podcast today.
Too easy. It was a pleasure.